I was just talking about some of the gross numbers
Right.
when it comes to football. The fact that, and we'll do this again in a little bit here when we get rolling, but
Mm-hmm.
when you look at the NFL, that's a body of that ever played the games like 28,000 people.
Right. Right.
Of which 20,000 are part of that lawsuit.
Yeah. And there's
And
so many more people, right, that play college football
between
at all levels of college football.
College football's over 770 something teams,
Right.
73,000 players, 1.1 million high school football players.
Right.
If you start looking at those numbers, if they ever prove, the onset of that repetitive head thing, it's ridiculous.
Right. I mean, they've now found. They've studied. There hasn't been as many studies. There's been studies of college football players' brains, alive and deceased. And there's been former college football players who never played a second of NFL or pro football that have had CTE and have had CTE in their 20s. Like they've killed themselves in their 20s and they found it in their brains. There's studies where they found all sorts of brain changes and what looks like damage in the brains of college football players. So it's definitely disturbing. Like, I mean, again, the one other thing that isn't really discussed or understood well by the public, I don't know if this goes beyond the realm of what we'll be talking about, is, it's changed a lot since the 50s, the 60s, even the 70s, in terms of the overall amount of exposure for someone who now is playing college football. They've been playing tackle football since they were 5 or 6 years old.
Oh, yeah.
And playing longer seasons, playing longer high school seasons, playing year round, just getting, again, just a lot more exposure than in the past. And if, the theory right now is that, it's kind of like smoking, where the more you're exposed to, the higher the risk. The more time, the more hits, the more chances something bad is happening inside your brain that is not going to heal or is irreversible. And that's disturbing, because that's changed a lot. I think that's changed too with at the pro level, sure, but even at the lower levels, I think it's also changed in terms of there's better orthopedic surgery. So if you get hurt, you get back quicker and you get hit more in the head again. And also the use of drugs and painkillers, I think that's changed too. There are high school teams that use Toradol, which is crazy.
Yeah.
But that happens.
Don't get me started on that one.
There's certainly college teams that do.
Yeah.
And a lot of them do. All the major ones do. And that's some of the advances there. You used to have a class of pain-killing drugs that, you do cortisones and stuff that you could put into joints and sort of play on injuries and sort of make those injuries worse but not feel it. And that's not good because you're getting more brain exposure as well. But a lot of these sort of opioid type painkillers, which are still used a lot, they're not necessarily great for taking that and being on the field. Like, you maybe take it during the week to try to get through.
Yeah.
Whereas things like Toradol and some of these other newer ones,
that's specifically
people get shot during halftime.
Yeah, that's specifically what they're used for.
Yeah, and not only getting you on the field when probably your body's like, you shouldn't be on here, so you're getting hit in the head more, but also getting you on the field, making you feel like Superman.
Yeah.
I've talked to a number of guys. I've talked to a number of NFL guys. Are just like, I talked to one guy that basically played linebacker for 12, 13 years. Good guy, was like an all-pro guy, like pretty well known. And he was telling me his last year, he started researching Toradol, and he's like, oh shit, I'm going to stop taking this. This is not good. And he's like, that's why I retired. Basically, it's like, I realized like I probably should have retired a long time ago because my body was not there anymore. And I was kind of just faking it and covering it up. So well, I do feel like all that stuff together, it's just increasing the risk for just even players that never even play down, in professional football.
What's the reaction been to your article?
I would say it's been kind of muted. I mean, I don't know if it's the time of year it came out or just people not paying attention. And people that have responded mostly have been like, this is really disturbing. This is bad. Thanks for writing this. There's always a handful of people that are like, either these guys know the risk or it's personal responsibility. Why should anyone be able to sue anybody for anything? right? There's sort of that, but that's a strain of thought, like in American politics and culture, that
Right.
people just sort of apply to anything. Like anytime they see anyone suing any sort of corporate or powerful interest, they're just like, it's your fault. No one forced you to play football. And it's kind of like, I asked them, like, did you read the story? That's not the morality being applied here. That's
Yeah.
not the lens being applied here. That's not part of the lawsuit. That's not what's being tested in court. It's literally nothing
Right.
to do with.
Well,
with what this is.
unfortunately, there's too many people out there that fall into a lot of camps, but one camp is the one you just talked about. You knew exactly what you were getting into.
Which is
there's
a huge part of the story. That's like that. No, they
Yeah.
did it. Like, who told them? Okay, like, one thing I find amusing.
we were
from
lied to for decades.
Of course.
And there
Of
were
course.
no informed decisions.
No, there of course not. I mean, and even more recently, just putting a poster in locker rooms does not necessarily mean that you're informed. I mean, I'll tell you one thing. When people say, the people that say these guys know the risk are the same people generally that also say, we don't know what the risk is. Nobody's proven anything. And I'm just kind of like, you have to pick one of those. You can't have it both ways. Either if you want to make the argument, which is, like, to my mind, based on evidence, completely untrue, that nobody knows anything and we really have no idea about anything. And we can't say that getting hit in the head is actually bad for your brain. Maybe it is. Who knows? We'll know in 50 years, right? Like, if you're going to make that disingenuous argument, you can't turn around and be like, these guys know the risk. The leagues and the teams and the schools aren't responsible.
Yeah.
It's definitely one or the other.
Well, the other thing it falls into, I was involved recently out in California. There was some legislation out there proposed that no padded football helmets, all that. In this case, it was until about 12 years old.
Right. I saw that. Mm-hmm.
I don't think they should be playing before high school. I think 9th grade is about when you should start putting on pads.
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason for it.
Personally. But some of the people just go bonkers. I mean, they're talking, the nanny state and Big Brother getting involved in our business. And you know what? I hate to be somebody that, just does blanket things as far as titles or looking at people. But so many of these guys never were frustrated jocks getting their vicarious thrills through watching their kids beat the crap out of each other. And that's going to make them tougher in life down the road.
Right.
No, that's going to give them brain damage.
Right. There's absolutely no reason little kids have to put on helmets and smash each other. There's no upside to it. It's not even, I have a friend who works sort of in this field, and he didn't do this formally. He kind of did it informally. He was looking at, I think, Texas and maybe California, but he was sort of crunching the numbers on the number. He's a statistician. He's like, if you look at the number of NFL players you would expect to come out of those states versus the number that actually come out of there, he's like, you could kind of make the argument that youth football is actually destroying the seed corn, even though the NFL, that like these guys are burning out, getting hurt, or dropping out before they'd get there because they're playing too early, which I think is probably some truth. So even from a totally self-interested NFL standpoint, they might not be as bad off as they think by defending youth football, which I don't know. I actually have studied that a lot. And I sort of I agree with you that there's a lot of people out there that, they're in it for sort of the wrong reasons. And I think when people start talking about bubble wrap and they start talking about nanny state, to me, that's sort of a tell, like they're shifting what the argument is about away from the simple idea of public health, because it's not controversial. Like, do you remember buckyballs? Do you know what those were? Yeah. Okay, like, I don't know if anyone even died from those, but I think like 6 kids choked on them and had to go to the emergency room, and they pulled them from the market. And that wasn't controversial. It wasn't really controversial. No one was like, this is the nanny state. How dare you do this, right? Like, child seats in cars, maybe at one point they were controversial, not controversial now. Seatbelts were controversial for a long time. Oh, yeah. People made the same arguments against seatbelts. It's not controversial now. Like not having cigarette vending machines in schools. Like, that's not controversial.
Having both parents smoking in the car with the windows rolled up. when
Exactly.
you were a
Like
kid.
not selling beer to kids is not
Yeah.
controversial. Like
Yeah.
all these things, like these are public health things.
Hey,
Um,
I got to ask you though. I mentioned your article,
yeah.
and patrickhruby.net is where you can find it.
Mm.
What was the experience like talking to Deb Plotz?
Really painful. So and difficult. And all credit to Deb for sharing an incredibly painful story.
And just to interrupt you 1 second, just to
Mhm.
set up, her husband Greg Plotz played at the University of Texas and had an early onset as it turned out, CTE, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's not necessarily a. He had early onset dementia, and it
Dementia.
turned out to be CTE after he died, and his brain was autopsied and
Right. Well,
examined by
that's
researchers at
the
Boston.
only way they can find it. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Currently, we can only diagnose CTE after death. We literally have to cut your brain into slices, put it under a microscope, stain it for
Right.
certain proteins, and be able to see it. So yeah, but the symptoms obviously take place during life, or in most cases take place during life. And yeah, so talking to Deb it was really hard. I mean, she and her family and Greg went through what many people who have dealt with this disease or other forms of dementia, and Alzheimer's type diseases have gone through, which is when your brain deteriorates, you deteriorate. Your brain is in a lot of ways who you are, and so you sort of disappear slowly, painfully over time, to where you might start off by being irritable, forgetting where your keys are, making simple mistakes. Greg was an artist and an art teacher, and sort of a beloved at both. He was an incredibly creative guy, um, and someone who was loved by his students. And over time, he lost that. He couldn't paint anymore. He lost his job as a teacher. He couldn't figure out how to like do simple arithmetic to do grades anymore, because he was just losing his mind slowly. Some of the painful stories she was telling me was there was a point where Greg wanted to move from where they lived in a ranch in Texas back to San Antonio, where they had originally met. And then when they did, they moved out of San Antonio, and then Greg wanted to go back to the ranch. And over time, Deb realized Greg kept saying, "I want to go home. I want to go home." And she realized what he meant was not a physical place, is that he wanted to go back in time to when he was a whole person, when he was himself, before his brain damage started to kick in. And that's a painful thing to go through. I mean, she talked about, towards the end, when things were getting worse, one of the few things that would help his symptoms was using medical marijuana, cannabis oils as well. They had to move to Colorado to sort of be able to try to do that.
Right.
And eventually it became unsustainable and moved back. Greg had a hard time in care homes because he was a strong, large former football player. And one of the symptoms he had emotionally and psychologically is that he was scared. He was frightened of other people, but he would sort of take that out. Like, he would shove his caregivers, or he'd push people in the hallway, and everybody was scared of him. And they're like, we can't keep him. So Deb ended up having to do this herself. They went back to Texas, and things got getting worse. Towards the end, they went to a hospice in Arkansas, and this is where Deb's family is from. And I'll always remember she told me about having to change his diaper. And he was not happy about this. I mean, he had incontinence. That was another symptom of the brain damage he was suffering. And her sister would have to hold his hands and say a prayer while she would change his diaper, standing upright.
Yeah.
Imagine having to do that with your husband, or your wife, or your significant other. And by the way, they're not 90 years old. Greg's still in his middle age. He should be enjoying his children, his life. He's not even really quite to retirement yet.
And this was 2009. He was initially diagnosed on the dementia side.
Right. 2009 is when he loses his job, and he's having all these problems, and he just kind of goes downhill all the way to 2015 when he passed away. And like I said, if anybody listening has been through this with a family member, they know how slow and painful and difficult and expensive It is. It's really it's something that one person described to me like this: when someone in your family has CTE or dementia or one of these brain injuries or brain diseases, it's like dropping a rock in a lake. It ripples out. It affects everyone around them. And so yeah, so sitting down with Deb to relive some of this, she was in tears at points, and I have to say, so was I.
Well, financially, how does a family get through this? Because obviously, from a liability standpoint, there's no settlement there. There are no dollars allocated. Was this through his teachers union? Was this, how did they deal with this?
They basically had insurance and savings. They had some money saved away from years of working. They I think they sold their farmhouse in Texas, so there was some money from that. But it was extremely costly. It was not easy. At one point, some of Greg's teammates, his old Texas teammates, actually raised money to help him, and they actually went out to Colorado, where Deb and Greg were at the time because of the marijuana issue, and presented him the money. And one of the saddest things, again, a sad story Deb told me, is his old teammate came to present this money, see how he was doing, give him support, and Greg did not remember who his teammate was.
Yeah,
which is just heartbreaking. And so, I mean, that's one good thing in this story, is that some of his former teammates were there for him. That those bonds are that strong, that friendship, that loyalty. That's really good. And there is an irony, though, that it was this strongly arguably, is still this sport that caused the problem in the first place.
Yeah, as a journalist, heck, as a regular person, how does being around a story like this sort of change you?
Well, it's difficult, right? Like, I'm a human being. Like, I can't really, I mean, to be a good journalist, it's true. You have to be objective. You have to think through things. You have to learn a lot, analyze a lot, process a lot, but you don't turn off your humanity, especially not in these kinds of stories. A lot of the job is being empathetic, which is also our job as humans on this earth, right? It's not like it's such a special thing. It's exclusive to journalists. And so it does change you over time. It's painful. I mean, people, Deb is not the first person I've talked to that's been through this. This is not the first family I've dealt with who have lost people to brain injuries related to football. And every single time that I step into their world and they're generous enough and brave enough to share their stories, it's very deeply emotionally affecting. I mean, I read about this years ago. 4 or 5 years ago, I stopped watching football entirely. And I'm like most people, I grew up watching the sport. I enjoyed it. I watched college football. I watched high school football. I watched NFL football. But the more I learned about the damage it was causing to the people who played it, who first and foremost as a fan are the people I liked, right? I've always really liked football players. I like athletes. They're bringing me a lot of joy and pleasure, and they're putting themselves through a lot to do that. How could you not like them? It just, once you meet them and you meet their families and you see what they're dealing with and what they've dealt with, it's just really hard to put on a game and think to yourself, every time you see a hit or every time there's a snap and the helmets collide the line, okay, like, people are setting themselves up for CTE. People are twisting and breaking neurons right now. And then on top of that, as a journalist, when you start to investigate, well, what is the NFL doing about this or not doing? What is the NCAA doing about this or not doing? What is the industry, the football industry, doing or not doing? Yeah. Who's paying for this? Is it the public? Is it the sport?
Is college football dealing with this head on?
No.
Do they know? Do they know what's coming?
I mean, I think they have an idea of what's coming, but in my opinion, they're doing what the rest of the industry is doing, which is trying not to pay for it. I think the number one concern across the board is, okay, we've got this health crisis here. And it's a public health crisis, by the way, because this sport is not just, hundreds of guys in the NFL. It's thousands of college players, many of them at public institutions, and many millions more high school and youth players. So this is definitely a public health issue. It's not just a private industry issue. And I think in the NCAA's case, in the story, it points out there's evidence. People have known for a long time, both within college football and in the medical community, that getting hit in the head can be bad for your brain. It can be bad in the short term. It can be bad in the long term. Concussions are bad. Also, the subconcussive blows that add up can be bad too. This is not new knowledge. We have a better idea, yes, now than we did in the 1930s or the 1920s. But we had an idea then too. The NCAA had an idea then too. That's one of the things really interesting about this Putz lawsuit is it points out, if you go back in time, doctors at Harvard and other places that were playing college football were talking about this. We're writing about this, publishing papers about this, all the way back almost to the very beginning of the NCAA, which was founded, by the way, in the early part of the 20th century, like basically specifically to address the problem of college football players dying.
The violence of college football.
And largely from head injuries.
Yeah.
So it's like the foundational mission of the NCAA is to protect these athletes from injuries, and particularly head and brain injuries. And yet the NCAA, if you look at its history, has done arguably the bare minimum or nothing at all to do so. It's not been a leader. It's been behind. It's still behind right now. And I can explain a little bit why if people want to hear about that.
Okay. Well, can you give us a Cliff Notes version?
Yeah, the Cliff Notes version is essentially, there are rules you can put in place. They're not going to make football completely safe, but they're going to make it safer. And they are things that, again, we have known about and have been recommended to the NCAA, even sometimes by its own committees and its own doctors and in its own medical handbook, even since the 1930s. For instance, the one thing we all know, if you have a concussion, like you need to be taken off the field, you need to be taken out of the game. You should not return to play until you're symptom-free, until you've been checked out by doctors, until somebody somewhere in medicine has looked at you, dealt with you, and helped you through to where you at least seem to be better. Again, that's not new. That goes back to the 1930s. There's ideas that, like, if you have one concussion or two concussions or three concussions, at some point you shouldn't be allowed to play anymore. Again, that's something we do now, but that's also been known and recommended since the 30s. Those are things the NCAA could have put rules in for, but did not. Over time, like in the mid 90s to like the beginning of the last decade, it started to make recommendations and guidelines for its member schools to do stuff like that. But there's a catch. A guideline is not a rule. What I mean by that, it's just the NCAA saying to its schools, hey, you should do this, not you will do this. And if you don't, we will investigate and punish you, which is what they do in terms of athletes getting any money under the table.
Right.
God forbid that happens.
That
right?
they'll do.
The NCAA has done that for decades. The NCAA has been zealous in policing who gets the money. But when it comes to athlete safety, athlete brain safety, to this day, it does not police that. It just makes strongly worded suggestions. That's, I think, more than anything, the real problem here. The NCAA, which was founded to protect these athletes, has abdicated that very responsibility when it comes to their brains.
Well, Patrick, I really want to thank you for joining me. We could do this for an hour, but
sure.
I'd love to have you back on here down the road, because this is a subject, like you say in your article, that's patrickhruby.net. That's HRUBY.net. This subject's not going away.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all.
Not even close.
This case is scheduled to go to trial in June. Mm-hmm. If it's not settled, which it could be settled at the last second. I would not be surprised if the NCAA tries to do that, because the facts of the case look bad and a loss could be very difficult for them. If they lose this case, it opens the door to a lot of other lawsuits against the NCAA and conferences, because Greg Pletz played in the 60s and the early 70s. So if he can win a case, think of the guys that played in the 90s and the 2000s, when much more of this stuff was much more surfaced up in the public consciousness.
Right.
There are less excuses for the NCAA. Think of you're a juror, right? From a jury standpoint. Yeah. There's way less excuses for those guys, and they've probably been exposed to more damage.
That nexus point, information-wise, is sort of the mid to late 90s into the early 2000s, where the information the genie got out of the bottle.
Right.
And though they kind of denied it, the powers that be in football in general, sort of their cover got blown when it came to sort of ignoring this subject.
Right. And there's going to be, look, there are going to be more Greg Putzes. There are going to be more cases. Back when the NCAA settled a class action concussion suit, they settled this in the middle of this decade. It was brought by all athletes, not just football players.
Mm-hmm.
The suit was settled to cover medical monitoring. So basically medical tests for brain damage, but it wasn't, unlike the NFL settlement, there are no payouts if you have problems, if you have damage. And because of that, the athletes reserve the right to bring suits like Greg is bringing. They can bring in personal injury suits. They can bring it against schools. They can bring it against conferences. They can bring it against the NCAA. In that settlement, there's a little part where they estimate, okay, how much is it going to cost us over these years to do this medical monitoring? And within that, they estimate there's going to be up to something like, for the athletes that played NCAA football or played NCAA sports, but it's going to be mostly football in this case, between like the 50s and like the late 2000s, up to something like 50 CTE cases a year. So think about that.
Wow.
And that it could be higher, right? It could be lower, it could be higher, but even 5 is a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like it's
people, as they've seen in the early settlements here with this, the NFL side, those projected numbers between CTE and dementia, Parkinson's, everything else that's just been, every number's been blown out of the water.
Yeah, and that's something else that's really interesting that has gone underreported is what you just said. The numbers in the NFL settlement are so much higher than what were projected, which should give us an idea, unless there's widespread fraud, which I doubt, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's extremely hard to commit Parkinson's fraud.
Yeah.
That's really disturbing for the future of football. When the numbers are higher than even projected, that's a sign that like this is worse than we thought. Yeah. This population is sicker than we thought. This sport is causing more damage than we thought.
Well, I really want to thank you for joining us. And make it clear we all love football, but you've got to make an informed decision and know what you're getting into. But thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, man.
How you doing?